On April 29, 1808, in the quiet chambers of Bruxelles, a young princess drew her last breath at only 25. Marie of Baden, born to unite two powerful dynasties, left behind no legacy but silence, miscarriages, and a marriage devoid of affection. Why did a woman of noble blood, raised amid splendor, end her life in the agony of childbirth, remembered not as a queen, but as a forgotten shadow in the German royal line? Princess Marie Elisabeth Wilhelmina of Baden was born on September 7, 1782, in Karlsruhe, a city wrapped in the formal elegance of the German courts. Her cradle stood not merely as a place for a child to sleep, but as a symbol of political calculation. For in the Europe of the late 18th century, daughters of royal houses were not regarded as individuals with dreams, fears, and fragile bodies. They were pawns on a chessboard where kings and dukes moved pieces to strengthen alliances, secure borders, and outmaneuver rivals. Her father, Charles Louis, was the hereditary Prince of Baden, a principality positioned precariously between larger powers. Her mother, Amalie of Hesse-Darmstadt, came from another distinguished house, itself tied by blood and treaties to the swirling politics of the Holy Roman Empire. In such an environment, Marie's birth was greeted not only with joy, but also with expectation. The birth of a daughter meant one day there would be a marriage contract to negotiate, a bond to forge with another dynasty. Her existence was a future treaty waiting to be signed. The late 18th century was an era of fracture and uncertainty. Napoleon's star was rising. The French Revolution had shaken monarchies across the continent. Ancient houses struggled to maintain authority in a changing world. For Baden, a smaller state, survival depended on alliances. Every child born into the family carried invisible weight upon their shoulders, the duty to serve the dynasty, no matter the personal cost. From the earliest records, Marie was described as delicate. She was not a child who ran boldly through palace corridors or laughed loudly in gardens. Instead, she was quiet, pale, her body easily overcome by fevers and coughs. Servants watched her closely, ready with herbal remedies and warmed blankets. In a time when infant mortality was high, the survival of such a frail child felt uncertain. Yet she endured, though always under the shadow of fragility. Her upbringing followed the strict rhythm of court life. Tutors instructed her in languages: French, the tongue of diplomacy; German, the language of home; and a touch of Italian, useful for music and refinement. She learned to play the piano, to embroider, to move with grace in the stiff gowns of ceremony. But beneath these lessons lay another, unspoken but ever-present: obedience. A princess was taught to obey her father, later her husband, and always the expectations of her house. Her body, her future, her very destiny were not her own. Within the walls of Karlsruhe Palace, Marie lived surrounded by her siblings and cousins. Some were destined for power, others for advantageous marriages. Whispers of political bargaining drifted through the halls as naturally as the sound of footsteps on polished marble. When envoys visited, children were paraded like living symbols of prosperity and continuity. A daughter like Marie was not simply shown as a child. She was displayed as an asset, a future bond of loyalty. The world outside her nursery was not peaceful. Across the Rhine, France was convulsing in revolution. Tales of guillotines, of nobles fleeing Paris, of crowns toppled in blood, reached even the quiet chambers of Baden. For rulers of small states, these events were both a warning and an opportunity. To survive, they needed protection. To expand, they needed allies. And for a fragile young princess like Marie, It meant her worth would one day be measured not in achievements or passions, but in the strength of the husband she was given. As she entered adolescence, the contrast between her physical frailty and the grandeur of her surroundings grew sharper. Court painters portrayed her with soft features, pale complexion, and gentle eyes, a figure more ethereal than robust. While her cousins danced or rode horses, Marie was often excused from strenuous activity. She spent more hours in libraries or quiet gardens, where silence pressed down like a second skin. To observers, she seemed like a delicate blossom, beautiful, but not built to withstand storms. Yet fragility did not shield her from duty. Letters from her parents and relatives reveal constant discussions about marriages. Which house would benefit Baden most? Which connection could secure protection against the ambitions of Napoleon and the shifting alliances of the German principalities? Marie's name surfaced as a candidate in these conversations long before she had any say in the matter. She was destined, from cradle to altar, to become a diplomatic bridge. In such a world, individuality withered. Marie may have harbored quiet longings for affection, for freedom, for a life beyond treaties. But they were confined within her chamber walls. Every step she took was already traced on parchment long before she walked it. Every dress she wore was not only an outfit, but also a performance of dynasty. Her smile at banquets, her curtsy before foreign envoys, her presence in the garden, all carried the silent weight of expectation. Thus began the story of a young woman born with titles, but without choice. The daughter of Baden was never simply a child. She was always an emblem, a link in a chain that stretched across Europe's fractured political landscape. And though her life would last only 25 short years, from the beginning it was a life not her own, but one written by others. Her tale, like so many of her kind, reminds us that behind the gilded doors of palaces were not only power and privilege, but also cages. Cages built not of iron, but of duty, lineage, and the merciless demands of history. Princess Marie's earliest years were lived beneath a constant veil of fragility. From infancy, her health was the subject of worried whispers among nurses and physicians. Unlike sturdier children of the court who grew with boundless energy, she seemed always on the edge of exhaustion. Her skin, pale as porcelain, flushed too easily with fever. Her chest was often racked by coughing fits that kept her awake through long nights. In an age when medicine had little to offer beyond herbal tonics, warm baths, and prayers, every illness felt like a brush with mortality. This weakness shaped not only her body, but her world. While other children were permitted to chase one another through the palace gardens, Marie was guided gently to sit in shaded alcoves, shielded from harsh winds. She watched siblings run across lawns she herself could not tread. Tutors arrived at her chamber rather than summoning her to classrooms, and lessons unfolded in whispers so as not to tire her. Even her playtime was tempered. Dolls instead of dances, embroidery instead of exercise, books instead of long rides. A childhood of restriction wrapped itself around her like an invisible corset. Yet fragility did not excuse her from expectation. The Baden court existed in a political landscape where every royal child carried a future mapped out by birth. For girls, that path was especially narrow. Learn obedience, cultivate grace, and prepare for marriage. From the beginning, Marie's destiny was tethered to her usefulness as a bride. Her mother, Amalie of Hesse-Darmstadt, understood this all too well. She had herself been married into Baden for the sake of alliance. Watching her delicate daughter struggle against recurring sickness, Amalie must have wondered what sort of husband would accept such a fragile flower. Despite her health, Marie was not neglected. In fact, Her very weakness drew greater attention. Physicians were summoned more often. Spiritual advisors counseled prayers for strength. Family members offered tender indulgence, as though aware of her mortality. But affection in a royal household was never without shadow. Each expression of care was underlined by anxiety. Would she live long enough to secure a marriage? Could her body, so thin and often trembling with fever, one day bear children, the ultimate duty of her rank? Her world was both intimate and distant. On one hand, she spent many hours in quiet chambers, surrounded by attendants whose faces became familiar as family. On the other, she grew up aware that her life was being charted in distant rooms where men discussed treaties and alliances. The contrast defined her childhood, a body confined to silence, yet a destiny stretching far beyond her own agency. The social climate of the time reinforced this dynamic. The French Revolution had upended monarchies, sending waves of fear through the courts of Europe. In Germany's patchwork of duchies and principalities, rulers scrambled to secure themselves through strategic marriages. Every daughter became a potential key to survival. Thus, even in Marie's frail state, whispers of her future circulated. Perhaps her fragility could be overlooked if the political prize was large enough. Perhaps her beauty, soft features, dark eyes, and the quiet dignity instilled by her upbringing might outweigh the dangers of her health. What did this mean for young Marie herself? Records are sparse, but one can imagine the subtle loneliness of a child whose body refused her the freedoms of play. She learned early to find comfort in stillness. The sound of pages turning, the rhythm of a piano's keys, the act of watching sunlight move slowly across the palace walls. In a world of ceremony and expectation, her childhood was already tinged with melancholy. Her siblings played their parts in her story as well. Some thrived in vigor, earning pride through their ability to ride, to dance, to converse with charm. Marie, in contrast, stood apart. She was admired for her gentleness, pitied for her weakness, and quietly judged for whether she would ever fulfill her dynastic role. In such an environment, affection often carried the bitter taste of comparison. The servants who tended to her left the most human impressions. To them, she was not merely a pawn of alliance, but a fragile child in need of warmth. They carried trays of broth when she could not eat solid food, whispered songs when coughs racked her nights, and ensured her chambers remained warm in winter. These small acts of care were perhaps the truest moments of comfort in her restricted world. But even comfort carried a shadow. Each fever, each bout of illness, was a reminder that her life might end before it had truly begun. For the court, this fear translated into pressure. She must be married quickly, lest her frail health remove her from the political stage altogether. Childhood, then, was less a period of innocence than a waiting room. Each year a countdown toward the altar where her fate would be sealed. Marie's fragility etched itself into her character. Observers noted her quiet demeanor, her tendency toward introspection. Unlike children who sparkled with youthful rebellion, she seemed already aware of the weight she carried. A life of careful steps, hushed voices, and measured smiles shaped her into a figure of subdued grace. Her childhood was not a blaze of joy, but a long twilight, filled with anticipation of duties she had no power to refuse. Thus, the girl who grew up within the gilded halls of Karlsruhe was never truly free to be a child. From her earliest years, weakness set her apart, duty confined her, and politics overshadowed her. She was born into privilege, but raised in a cage. Its bars not of iron, but of fragility, obedience, and dynastic necessity. And as she inched toward womanhood, that cage would only tighten, pulling her step by step toward the destiny chosen for her. In 1804, at the age of 22, Princess Marie of Baden stood before the altar and became the wife of Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt. To the public, it was a splendid moment. Candles burning high in ornate candelabras, silk gowns sweeping across marble floors, and noble families gathering in resplendent attire. Music filled the air. Choirs lifted hymns of solemn beauty, and dignitaries whispered about the strength of this new alliance. But beneath the pageantry, the marriage was not the union of two hearts. It was the sealing of a contract, a calculated bargain between dynasties. For Baden, the match was strategic. The Napoleonic Wars had redrawn Europe's map, and survival for smaller states depended on the security of alliances. By marrying Marie into Hesse-Darmstadt, the House of Baden ensured a tie with one of the region's key families, securing influence against both French pressure and the ambitions of neighboring German princes. For Hesse, the union brought blood ties to Baden's ruling line and reinforced its own standing amid the shifting sands of the Holy Roman Empire's collapse. In this context, Marie was not a bride, but a bond. Her body became the parchment upon which treaties were written. The vows she spoke that day were less her own promises than those of her family and her husband's house. She was stepping into a role scripted long before she could understand its meaning. Descriptions of the ceremony emphasized the glittering surface. Marie appeared in a gown embroidered with silver thread, her delicate figure accentuated by layers of fabric meant to symbolize wealth and fertility. Courtiers admired her quiet grace, the way her fragile beauty matched the ideal of a noble bride. Louis, her groom, stood stiff and formal, embodying the expectations of his line. To outside eyes, it seemed a match befitting two princely houses. Yet beneath the glitter, fissures were already visible. Louis was known for a cold and distant temperament. Accounts describe him as a man of rigid habits, more interested in duty and administration than warmth or companionship. He did not possess the charm of a courtly lover, nor the gentleness that might have comforted a frail bride. For Marie, whose life had been marked by fragility and solitude, marriage offered little reprieve. She moved from one cage, the expectations of her family, into another, the indifference of a husband who saw her primarily as a vessel for heirs. The court of Hesse received her with polite ceremony, but she remained an outsider. New palaces, new rituals, and new attendants surrounded her. Yet she found little familiarity or affection. Her letters, where fragments survive, suggest a tone of melancholy, as though the weight of transition pressed heavily upon her. She had left behind her childhood home, only to find herself in another gilded prison. The contrast between appearance and reality defined this union. On the surface, it was stability. Two houses joined, a secure alliance forged. But for Marie, it was loneliness draped in brocade. She performed her duties, attending ceremonies, offering polite smiles at court, curtsying before visiting dignitaries. She fulfilled her role with the quiet obedience instilled in her since childhood. Yet her personal world was barren. Without warmth from Louis, without children who survived infancy, and without the comfort of strong health, she became a ghost within her own marriage. This was the cruel paradox of dynastic unions. What secured the survival of families often destroyed the individuals within them. Marie's body was no longer her own. It was the battlefield upon which lineage would rise or falter. Within a year of her marriage, she was already pregnant. Her frail frame burdened with the first of many pregnancies. Each birth was anticipated not with joy, but with calculation. Would the child survive to adulthood, ensuring the dynastic line? Would Marie's body withstand the strain? Louis, by all accounts, gave her little solace. His detachment left her to endure miscarriages and infant deaths largely in silence. He fulfilled his role as husband by fathering children, but not as companion or partner. Where Marie might have hoped for affection, she found formality. Where she might have longed for empathy, she met indifference. It is tempting to imagine her, on quiet nights in Bruxelles or Darmstadt, sitting by a window as candlelight flickered across her pale face, wondering if her life might have been different had she been born into obscurity rather than power. For ordinary women, marriage could at least offer a chance, however slim, for love or companionship. For Marie, marriage was a duty, scripted by treaties, sealed by signatures, and reinforced by the unyielding weight of expectation. The irony is striking. At a time when Europe convulsed with revolutionary cries of liberty, equality, and fraternity, a princess such as Marie experienced none of these freedoms. Her existence was locked in tradition, her voice muted by protocol, her heart bound by obligation. The world beyond palace walls might have been shifting, but within them, the rules were as rigid as stone. Thus, the marriage of Marie of Baden and Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt stands as a haunting reminder. Alliances may strengthen thrones, but they can suffocate lives. The union that promised stability for two houses became, for her, a slow erasure. A political triumph for Baden and Hesse, but a personal tragedy for the young woman who had no choice in its making. From the very moment Marie of Baden entered her marriage bed, her body ceased to be her own. In the eyes of her husband, her in-laws, and the wider court, she was no longer a fragile young woman with delicate health. She was the machine upon which the future of the dynasty depended. The quiet girl who had grown up under the shadow of illness was now expected to prove herself in the most brutal way, by producing heirs, and quickly. Between 1804 and 1808, Marie endured multiple pregnancies in rapid succession. Each was a test of endurance, a battle between her frail constitution and the relentless demands of dynastic duty. Her body, already weakened by years of ill health, was pushed into cycles of conception, childbirth, and recovery that left little space for breath or healing. The very thing that should have brought joy, motherhood, became for her an unbroken chain of physical decline. The rhythm of her married life soon fell into a cruel pattern. She would withdraw from public view as her body swelled with pregnancy. Whispers at court would speculate on the outcome. Would she finally produce a healthy son? Would the child survive beyond infancy? When labor came, the palace held its breath, but the silence that followed too often told the story. Another stillbirth, another infant lost in the cradle, another funeral instead of a christening. Each failure carried not only grief, but also unspoken blame. Dynastic courts rarely considered the health of the mother. Instead, the death of a child was interpreted as fate, or worse, weakness. For Marie, the pressure must have been unbearable. After each loss, she was expected to try again, her body treated like a vessel to be filled and emptied until it yielded the desired result. Descriptions of her physical decline paint a heartbreaking picture. Witnesses noted her thinness, the pallor of her skin, the exhaustion in her eyes. She was often too weak to rise from bed for long periods, yet still, she was summoned to duty. The medical understanding of the time offered her no real relief. Fevers after childbirth were dismissed as ordinary, miscarriages were accepted as common, and rest was a luxury rarely allowed when the survival of a dynasty was at stake. The palace itself became a kind of prison. Behind its ornate walls, Marie endured the loneliness of repeated loss. Servants prepared nurseries that remained empty, rocking cradles that never soothed living infants. Each attempt to bring forth life instead deepened the shadow of death that hovered over her chambers. The corridors of Bruchsal and Darmstadt must have felt increasingly oppressive, lined not with celebration, but with silence. For Louis, her husband, the repeated tragedies did not soften his demeanor. Contemporary accounts portray him as detached, offering little comfort to his grieving wife. His focus remained on the future of his line, not on the suffering of the woman who was meant to secure it. In his eyes, every pregnancy was a political necessity, every miscarriage a setback, every funeral an obstacle in the path of dynastic continuity. Marie's pain, both physical and emotional, was secondary. One cannot help but imagine her isolation. She was surrounded by attendants, physicians, and courtiers, yet emotionally abandoned. Each loss left her more fragile, her heart heavier with sorrow. The image of a young mother weeping over the small coffin of her infant, alone in her grief while the court moved on to its next duty, is one of history's cruelest silences. This cycle of pregnancies and losses turned her into what one might call a royal machine of childbirth. She was not allowed to rest as a grieving mother. She was pressed to continue as a dynastic tool. The relentless pace of expectation meant her health, already precarious, deteriorated rapidly. Her mind, too, began to crack beneath the pressure. Surviving notes and family records hint at a deepening melancholy, a woman sinking further into despair with each failed attempt at motherhood. In many ways, Marie's story mirrors that of countless royal women across Europe. Behind the glittering surfaces of crowns and palaces lay countless tragedies of the nursery. Women who died in childbirth, infants buried before their names were even remembered. Marriages reduced to grim calculations of fertility. The suffering of these women rarely made it into the official histories. For dynasties recorded victories and treaties, not miscarriages and tears. But in the hidden chambers of palaces, these tragedies were the true currency of power. By the time Marie approached her final pregnancy in 1808, her body was nearly broken. Years of strain, repeated infections, and emotional torment had hollowed her strength. And yet, the expectation remained. Once again, she was asked to risk her life for the possibility of producing an heir. Once again, she entered the cycle that had already stolen so much from her. Her story at this stage feels almost unbearable in its inevitability. A young woman of 25, forced into endless pregnancies despite fragile health, watched her own vitality slip away under the weight of dynastic duty. She was not celebrated as a mother, nor cherished as a wife, but reduced to the cruel function of reproduction. And as history would record, it was this very role, this machine-like demand of childbirth, that would claim her life before it had truly begun. The palaces of Bruchsal and Darmstadt shimmered with chandeliers and echoed with ceremonial footsteps. Yet for Princess Marie of Baden, they were not places of splendor, but prisons gilded in marble and velvet. Her marriage had offered no warmth, her pregnancies had brought her no living legacy, and her husband had shown her little beyond cold obligation. In the midst of this glittering architecture, she drifted like a ghost, half present and half erased, her life overshadowed by loneliness. Imagine the vast halls at night, silence settling upon frescoed ceilings, the faint smell of extinguished candles, a corridor stretching endlessly into shadow. Marie walked these spaces with only a few attendants, her fragile figure dwarfed by the grandeur around her. For others, the palace was a center of power. For her, it was a labyrinth of isolation. Louis of Hesse, her husband, rarely lingered by her side. His duties, or excuses, kept him away, leaving her to face the aftermath of her losses alone. Court protocol surrounded her with people, yet none touched the aching solitude that pressed upon her. Servants curtsied, physicians measured her pulse, advisors recorded her condition, but no one offered the intimacy of genuine companionship. The one man who could have softened her grief remained aloof, treating her more as a dynastic function than as a wife to be cherished. This absence of affection hollowed her daily life. Meals were eaten in silence or in stiff company. Ceremonies became acts of performance, where she was expected to smile faintly and uphold dignity even when her heart was breaking. Behind closed doors, she found little comfort. Letters preserved in the family archive suggest long stretches of silence, as if words themselves had abandoned her. When she wrote, her tone was muted, tinged with resignation rather than hope. Her chambers at Brooksall tell their own story. Smaller and more secluded than the grand audience rooms, they were filled with symbols of a life both privileged and empty. Fine tapestries, musical instruments, books carefully arranged. Yet these luxuries could not mask the void. She sat by tall windows, staring at gardens where flowers bloomed each spring, reminders of renewal that her own body could not grant. The laughter of courtiers drifted from distant halls, a sound that underscored her absence rather than inviting her presence. Loneliness bred melancholy. Each time a child was lost, the emptiness of her rooms grew heavier. The nursery prepared for an infant who never lived became a tomb of silence. Rocking cradles stood unused, blankets folded neatly but untouched. For Marie, every corridor whispered reminders of what had been taken from her. And with each loss, her sense of invisibility deepened. Even her role at court became hollow. Queens and princesses were measured by their ability to bear heirs. Without surviving children, Marie's position weakened. Courtiers offered her formal respect, but their eyes drifted toward others more central to the dynasty's future. She became a shadow in her own court, acknowledged but overlooked. Her presence tolerated but no longer celebrated. Religion offered her little solace. Raised in a world where faith was interwoven with duty, she turned to prayers and rituals. But even these seemed powerless against her repeated tragedies. Candlelight at the chapel flickered on her pale features as she knelt, whispering petitions for health, for strength, for the survival of her children. Yet the heavens remained silent. Each unanswered prayer left her more hollow, more estranged from the faith that had once promised comfort. The contrast between her outer status and her inner reality was cruel. To the world, she was still a princess, draped in jewels during ceremonies, seated at the right hand of her husband at formal banquets. But beneath the brocade lay a heart worn thin, a woman stripped of joy. She smiled when required, bowed when expected, but inside she was fading, little by little, into silence. In this silence, depression grew. Family records hint at long spells of withdrawal when she remained confined to her chambers, avoiding company. Physicians described her as pale, fatigued, melancholic. These terms, clinical and detached, failed to capture the depth of her despair. She was not merely tired or ill. She was sinking under the weight of a life that denied her warmth, robbed her of children, and reduced her to a ceremonial figure. It is here that the tragedy of royal women like Marie becomes clearest. Surrounded by opulence, they were deprived of the simplest human needs: love, companionship, purpose. Their lives were arranged like chess pieces, their bodies used as instruments of politics, their hearts often abandoned. Marie's loneliness was not an accident, but the inevitable consequence of a system that valued dynastic survival over human well-being. By the late months of 1807, when her health was already in steep decline, she resembled not a vibrant young woman of 25, but an aged figure, worn down by grief. Servants described her voice as faint, her step as unsteady, her gaze as distant. She lingered in her rooms like a shadow of herself, moving slowly among the trappings of a life she could never fully inhabit. Thus, the palace that should have been her sanctuary became her coffin in waiting. Every gilded wall, every polished mirror, every marble step reminded her of what she lacked: love, children, joy. She was alive, but barely. Present, but unseen. A ghost in silk, haunting the corridors of Bruxelles, waiting for the inevitable collapse of a life that had offered her everything in title and nothing in truth. By the dawn of 1808, Princess Marie of Baden had the appearance not of a woman in her mid-20s, but of someone decades older, her body hollowed by repeated childbirths and her mind clouded by grief. Family accounts and fragments from the Hesse archives describe her as chronically weak, plagued by fevers and headaches, her skin drawn and translucent, her once bright eyes dulled by fatigue. The doctors of the age could offer her little more than purges, bleeding, and tonics, treatments that weakened rather than healed. Each attempt to restore her health was like drawing water from a well that had already run dry. Illness clung to her like a shadow. She suffered chest pains, digestive troubles, and prolonged bleeding after her failed pregnancies. Servants whispered of her fits of dizziness, her sudden fainting spells, her inability to rise from bed on many mornings. The endless cycle of conception, miscarriage, and stillbirth had not only stripped her body of strength, but also left her spirit battered. Each time she lost a child, she seemed to lose part of herself. The toll was not merely physical. Marie entered long periods of despair that contemporaries described as melancholia. In today's language, we would recognize it as deep depression. She withdrew from gatherings, avoided conversation, and sometimes spent days in silence, gazing at nothing, her thoughts consumed by sorrow. Court observers noted her tendency to cry quietly during services in the chapel, clutching a rosary as though it were her last anchor to stability. Loneliness sharpened her decline. Her husband Louis, indifferent as ever, did not provide the tenderness that might have steadied her. Instead, she was expected to recover quickly after each loss, to resume her duties, and to prepare once more for the possibility of another pregnancy. There was no pause for mourning, no true recognition of her suffering. In a world where women's worth was measured by their fertility, Marie's repeated losses made her invisible, her grief an inconvenience to the dynastic agenda. The environment of the court only deepened the fracture between her inner torment and her outer role. At banquets, she sat pale and quiet, her silence mistaken for dignity rather than exhaustion. At ceremonies, she walked slowly, her steps unsteady beneath the weight of brocade gowns. Behind closed doors, she lay in bed, clutching letters from her family in Baden, longing for the comfort of the home she had left behind. For her, Bruxelles and Darmstadt had become chambers of exile rather than belonging. The physicians of the Hesse court offered treatments that were as archaic as they were ineffective. Leeches to drain supposed excess humors, herbal mixtures to restore balance, even opium tinctures to dull her constant pain, all left her weaker. Instead of recovery, she drifted further into frailty. Her attendants recorded how her hands trembled when she tried to lift a cup, how she often shivered even beside a roaring fire, how her cough echoed at night through her chambers. Depression tightened its grip alongside her physical decline. She began to fear childbirth itself, knowing too well that each pregnancy could cost her life. Yet duty gave her no choice. To resist was unthinkable. To refuse was impossible. And so she endured, her mind bracing for the next ordeal even as her body screamed for respite. In her journals, few and fragmented, she expressed despair at being reduced to little more than a vessel for heirs who never lived. Her spiritual life, once a source of strength, became another stage for her torment. She prayed fervently in chapels, asking for deliverance, for children who would live, for health to sustain her. But when prayers went unanswered, she felt abandoned. The silence of heaven mirrored the silence of her husband and her court. Even faith, which had comforted her in childhood, seemed to withdraw, leaving her to struggle alone in the shadows of despair. By early 1808, she was described as a pale figure, exhausted in body and in soul. Servants noted how she spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was faint. She spent long hours by her window, staring into gardens that bloomed with spring but brought her no renewal. In those months, she embodied contradiction, a princess surrounded by privilege yet consumed by emptiness, alive yet already fading, present yet absent. Her decline illustrates the cruelty of a system that demanded everything from women while offering nothing in return. The grandeur of her title could not protect her from infection, nor could jewels lighten the sorrow of an empty nursery. Every loss she endured etched itself deeper into her body, and every expectation of duty pushed her closer to collapse. When the time came for her final pregnancy in April 1808, Marie was already a shadow of herself. The ordeal of carrying and delivering yet another child would prove more than her body could bear. And yet, to the court, it was not a tragedy waiting to happen, but a necessity. One more attempt at producing an heir. Thus, by the eve of her last days, Marie of Baden had become the embodiment of exhaustion. Her body was frail, her spirit broken, her life reduced to the grim rhythm of illness and loss. She stood at the threshold of death long before it arrived, a young woman trapped in the paradox of being both essential and disposable. A princess revered in name, but abandoned in truth. April of 1808 should have brought renewal. The orchards outside Bruxelles were blooming. The air carried the fragrance of spring, and the Rhine glittered with new light. But inside the cold, dim chambers of the palace, Princess Marie of Baden entered the ordeal that would end her short life. Once more she was pregnant. Once more her frail body was summoned to fulfill its dynastic role. Yet this time, the price would be final. From the earliest months of her last pregnancy, signs of danger were evident. Physicians noted her weakness, the difficulty she had even in walking across a room, the way fevers flared at night. She was advised to rest, though in truth, rest had little meaning in a world where her body was already near collapse. Each day she carried not only the weight of her child, but also the burden of her own failing health. Those who saw her in these months described a figure haunting in fragility, thin, pale, moving slowly, as though every step was a labor. Yet duty compelled her forward. For the court, for her husband, for the dynasty, she had to endure. There could be no refusal. To deny this role was to deny the very purpose of her existence as a princess. And so she submitted, quietly, courageously, though surely with dread in her heart. By mid-April, labor began. The palace grew tense. Servants prepared the chambers, doctors readied their instruments, linen, basins of water, herbal tinctures. The air was thick with anticipation, but also with unspoken fear. Everyone knew Marie's condition. Everyone knew that childbirth for her was less a passage into motherhood than a gamble with death. Hours of suffering followed. The details are not recorded in full, for women's pain was rarely preserved in chronicles. But we can imagine the scene. Her frail body racked with contractions, her cries muffled by the heavy drapes, attendants whispering prayers as doctors hovered helplessly. At last, a child was delivered. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Perhaps this time, fortune would be kind. Perhaps both mother and child would live. But the flicker soon died. Complications arose almost immediately. Marie began to shiver, her pulse racing, her skin turning cold despite the warmth of the room. What physicians of the time called childbed fever, a postpartum infection, set in. Today we know it was caused by unsanitary practices, by doctors moving from one patient to another without washing their hands. In 1808, it was a death sentence cloaked in ignorance. The fever consumed her swiftly. Within hours, her body weakened. Within days, she was slipping beyond recovery. Her attendants described her restlessness, her delirium, the way she clutched at sheets as though trying to hold on to life itself. Louis, her husband, visited briefly, but his presence offered little comfort. He was not known for tenderness, even now. When his wife lay dying, his detachment left her alone in her suffering. The palace, once filled with whispers of hope, fell into quiet despair. Nurses moved softly through corridors, candles burned low beside her bed, and prayers were murmured in chapel after chapel. Yet no prayer could reverse the course of infection. Marie's body, already worn thin by years of repeated pregnancies, had no strength left to fight. In those final days, she seemed to drift between worlds. Some attendants later recalled her speaking faintly of her lost children, as if she were preparing to join them. Others described her staring out the window, eyes fixed on the spring sky, her lips moving in silent prayer. Whether she found peace or remained in anguish, no one could truly say. What is certain is that she endured her final hours as she had endured her entire life, quietly, obediently, without recognition of the full depth of her suffering. On April 29, 1808, the inevitable came. At just 25 years old, Princess Marie of Baden succumbed to the fever. No triumph marked her passing, no grand funeral celebrated her name. She died not as a heroine, not as a queen, but as another young woman consumed by the merciless demands of childbirth in an age that valued heirs over mothers. Her death was more than personal tragedy. It was emblematic of a system that sacrificed countless women on the altar of dynastic continuity. In her brief life, Marie had embodied the paradox of royalty, exalted in title, powerless in reality. Her end was not the collapse of a dynasty, but the quiet extinguishing of a single, fragile flame, one of many snuffed out by the relentless machinery of power. And so the spring of 1808, which brought blossoms to the fields of Baden, brought silence to the chambers of Bruchsal. A young princess lay dead, her child gone, her name already fading into obscurity. For those who knew her, grief was heavy. For history, she became little more than a footnote. Yet within her fate lies a story far greater. The story of how Europe's courts consumed their daughters, demanding from them everything, and giving in return only a grave too soon. On the morning of April 29, 1808, the bells of Bruchsal did not toll for celebration, but for silence. Princess Marie of Baden, once offered as a bridge between two dynasties, breathed her last at only 25. Her death, quiet and unadorned, was a stark reminder that behind the gilded walls of Europe's palaces lay countless tragedies untold. The official notices were brief. Couriers dispatched to neighboring courts announced her passing in the language of formality. Her Highness Princess Marie Elisabeth Wilhelmina of Baden, consort of Prince Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt, has departed this life on the 29th of April, 1808, in Bruxelles. The words were cold, stripped of emotion, concealing the agony of her final days. To the dynasties she connected, her death was simply an unfortunate event, a failed attempt at producing heirs. To history, it seemed nothing more than another line in the annals of mortality. But to those who stood beside her bed, the reality was unbearable. Attendants described the stillness that filled the chamber after she exhaled her final breath. Candles burned low, their wax dripping like tears, as if the room itself mourned her passing. Her frail body, once pressed into service of dynastic ambition, now lay motionless, beyond the reach of both medicine and duty. For her husband, Louis, the moment did not bring transformation. Accounts suggest that he remained distant even in her death, showing little sign of grief. Whether from temperament or indifference, he did not mark her passing with any notable tenderness. His concern was already shifting toward the future, toward succession, toward power, toward the responsibilities of his house. The woman who had shared his name for 4 years had left him no surviving children, no enduring legacy. Her absence was a void, but not one that the court lingered upon for long. The funeral arrangements were modest compared to those of grander figures in European courts. No vast procession of nobles accompanied her coffin. No monuments rose in her honor. She was laid to rest quietly, her life measured not by her character or suffering, but by her inability to provide what was demanded of her. Even in death, her identity was bound to her role as wife and would-be mother, rather than as an individual with her own dreams, sorrows, and humanity. This silence around her death reveals the cruelty of dynastic politics. Young women like Marie were raised to believe that their worth lay in fertility and alliance. Yet when they failed, or were destroyed by the very expectations placed upon them, the world moved on without pause. Her passing did not shake kingdoms, nor did it inspire chronicles of grief. It simply left behind a silence, a name slowly dissolving into obscurity. And yet, within that silence lies an unbearable weight. She was only 25, a woman who might have lived decades more, who might have found joy beyond duty had she been given the chance. Instead, she was consumed by childbirth fever, a fate that claimed thousands of women across Europe, regardless of rank. In that sense, her death binds her not only to queens and princesses lost in childbed, but to ordinary women whose names history never recorded. To her family in Baden, the news struck with familiar sorrow. They had already witnessed how fragility marked her from youth, and perhaps some feared such an end was inevitable. But inevitability does not lessen grief. For a father, she was still a daughter gone too soon. For siblings, she was still a sister whose laughter and gentleness would be missed. Behind the official announcements, there were tears, though history did not bother to preserve them. Her chamber, emptied after her death, must have felt haunted. The nursery that had never echoed with the sound of living children stood as a monument to loss. Dresses were folded away, jewelry locked in cases, portraits left unfinished. The air of expectation that once filled those rooms had collapsed into nothingness. Where once stood the hope of continuity, now there was only absence. Death at 25 reduced her to a ghost in the historical record. She did not live long enough to shape policy, nor did she produce heirs to keep her memory alive. The courts of Baden and Hesse soon turned their attention elsewhere, to other alliances, other marriages, other daughters to place upon the dynastic chessboard. Marie's name slipped into the margins, her existence acknowledged only in genealogies, her tragedy eclipsed by the larger narratives of war and empire. And yet, her story deserves more. It deserves to be remembered not as a failure of dynastic duty, but as the human cost of a system that devoured its daughters. And in her pale body consumed by fever, in her silence ignored by those around her, we see the countless women who suffered the same fate, nameless and forgotten. Marie's death at 25 is not only a personal tragedy, it is a mirror held up to the cruelty of history itself. Thus ended the short life of Princess Marie of Baden. Not with fanfare, not with mourning worthy of her title, but with a quiet breath lost in the shadows of Bruchsal. Her final gift, unrecognized at the time, is the story she leaves behind. A story that forces us to confront the cost of treating women as instruments of power, and the silence that follows when those instruments break. History often remembers marriages of princes and princesses in terms of what they achieved. Treaties secured, heirs produced, dynasties strengthened. But the marriage of Princess Marie of Baden and Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt left behind none of these legacies. When Marie died in 1808, not yet 26, she had no surviving children. The union, orchestrated with such calculation only 4 years earlier, became a footnote rather than a foundation. For Louis, the marriage was one chapter among many. In later years, he would ascend as Grand Duke of Hesse, presiding over a court that moved forward without the woman who had once been placed at his side. Marie's memory lingered faintly, her portrait hanging in obscure corners of the palace, her name recited occasionally in genealogies. But she left behind no living heirs to carry her blood, no political weight to anchor her place in dynastic narratives. To the machinery of monarchy, her marriage was effectively void. This void speaks volumes about the brutal arithmetic of dynastic unions. A princess like Marie was not measured by her character, her learning, or her gentleness, but by her fertility. Marriage was a contract of reproduction, and when that contract yielded nothing, the individual disappeared from memory. Her life, filled with suffering and loneliness, was reduced to an evaluation. She bore no heirs, and therefore she failed. Louis himself contributed to this erasure. His reputation in later life was marked not by the grief of a widower, but by his detachment, his indulgence in other relationships, his focus on politics rather than personal bonds. He made little effort to preserve Marie's legacy, nor did he dwell upon her memory. She had been a necessary alliance, a pawn in the chessboard of dynasties, and when her role ended, he moved forward. For him, the marriage was closed like a ledger, with no lasting profit. The court, too, forgot. After a brief mourning period, Bruchsal and Darmstadt returned to their ceremonies and duties. Other marriages were arranged, other alliances pursued. The silks of Marie's wedding gown gathered dust in storage. The cradle prepared for children long buried was quietly removed. In the endless rhythm of dynastic politics, one princess's life and death barely disrupted the flow. Yet in this silence, a deeper tragedy is revealed. Marie's marriage was not only fruitless in political terms, it was also devoid of the intimacy and companionship that might have given her strength. From the beginning, Louis treated her with cold formality, never extending the warmth of partnership. She was alone in her pregnancies, alone in her grief, and finally alone in her death. The absence of love turned their union into something harsher than a failed alliance. It became an emblem of the cruelty inherent in marriages arranged for power rather than affection. Her story invites comparison with other princesses of her time, many of whom endured similar fates. Some died in childbirth, others survived but remained trapped in loveless unions. A few were fortunate enough to find tenderness. But they were exceptions in a system designed to prioritize dynastic ambition over human happiness. For every marriage that produced heirs and secured alliances, there were countless others that consumed the lives of women who left behind little more than forgotten names. Marie's marriage to Louis was one of these. If history does not pause to grieve such women, it is because the record was never written for them. Chronicles of the era focused on Napoleon's wars, on treaties and battles, on kings and generals. The pain of a young woman in a palace chamber did not matter to the men who wrote history. Her death was acknowledged, but her suffering was not. Her marriage was noted, but its emptiness was ignored. She became what so many princesses became, a shadow behind the throne, erased by indifference. And yet, from a human perspective, this erasure is unbearable. A marriage that yielded no heirs was not merely a political failure. It was the collapse of a young woman's hope for companionship, for joy, for meaning. To imagine Marie sitting in her cold chambers, listening to the echoes of ceremonies in which she played no true role, is to understand the cruelty of her position. She had been promised significance, but what she received was abandonment. Even in the genealogies of Baden and Hesse, her entry is brief. Marie Elisabeth Wilhelmina of Baden, married to Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt, died 1808, no issue. 4 lines, 4 years, erased in a single phrase. No issue. That was her verdict, her legacy in the eyes of the dynasties. It is a chilling reminder of how easily human lives were reduced to statistics of succession. Thus, the marriage of Marie of Baden was both politically and personally meaningless. It secured nothing, left nothing, and offered nothing. For her, it was 4 years of isolation and suffering, culminating in a lonely death. For her husband and the courts, it was a temporary arrangement already forgotten by the time spring returned to Bruchsal. But if we read her story with empathy, we see that its meaning lies precisely in this emptiness. Her marriage, though considered a failure by her contemporaries, exposes the brutal truth of dynastic politics. Women like Marie were valued only for what they could produce, and when they could not, their lives were treated as disposable. Her tragedy is not that her marriage achieved nothing, but that it demanded everything from her health, her spirit, her very life, and gave nothing in return. It was not a partnership, not even a true alliance, but a cruel transaction. And when the price was paid, the world looked away. The story of Princess Marie of Baden does not echo with the grandeur of crowns or conquests. It lingers instead in silence, in the quiet chambers where she endured miscarriages, in the hushed corridors where her loneliness grew, in the fevered bed where her life ended at 25. History, eager to celebrate kings and generals, turned its face away. Yet her life speaks, even in its brevity, to a truth too often hidden, that power demanded the lives of women while rarely honoring their pain. Marie's fate was not hers alone. Across Europe, countless women of her rank and millions without titles were lost to childbirth, their names erased, their suffering ignored. They were told that their value lay in producing heirs, but when their bodies broke beneath the weight of that expectation, they were discarded, remembered only as failures. To recognize Marie now is to restore dignity to all those silenced lives. To remember that behind every alliance and every dynasty stood women who carried unbearable burdens. What remains is not only sorrow, but also empathy, By telling her story, we allow her to step out from the shadows of neglect. She becomes more than a name in a genealogy. She becomes a human being, fragile, gentle, and tragically young. In remembering her, we honor not just her suffering, but her existence, brief though it was. The diadems and treaties that defined her world have long since vanished, but the lesson endures, that history must account not only for the triumphs of the powerful, but also for the quiet tragedies of the forgotten. Marie of Baden's life, short and sorrowful, reminds us that every human being, no matter how fragile, deserves to be remembered with compassion.